Thank you very much for being with us today. Could you please tell us your name and where you were born and raised?
My name is Geline Williams, and I live in Richmond. Of course, I've lived here, born and raised in Richmond, lived here all of my life. And I'm very thankful for the long life that I've had.
Wonderful. Now, was your family originally from the Richmond area?
They came to Richmond. My mother was from Atlanta, born in Atlanta, and came to Richmond when her father passed away when she was literally almost a newborn baby. So she and her mother my grandmother came to Richmond to live with my grandmother's family. My mother was brought up here by her mother and by her mother's sister, who was my mother's great aunt, of course. And so she was brought up in that household, and her aunt had 2 boys, so they all grew up together down on Franklin Street.
I see. So it was your grandfather, your mother's father, who died when she was still a baby?
Yes, that's correct. And my grandfather, John Angus MacDonald, was a Catholic. My mother was from an Episcopal family, when my grandfather died so early in my mother's life, and they came to Richmond. My mother came to Richmond to live. After she was about 10 or 11 years old, her mother and her sister, Aunt John Geline, decided that they wanted to fulfill an obligation for my mother, and that was her father was Catholic, my grandfather, and they wanted her to know the Catholic faith. And yet she was brought up in an Episcopal and Protestant area and setting and home, and they had no close contact with the Catholic Church. Catholics here in Richmond were very few in the population.
Yes.
And so my family didn't know Catholics, and they wanted her to have a good formation, education in the Catholic faith, and for her to make a choice of what she would do. They sent her to a finishing school. Schools for girls at the higher level of education were called finishing schools. It was a boarding school in Washington, and run by the Nuns of the Holy Cross. And Mother went there at about 12 years of age and went through high school at this finishing school of the Holy Cross Academy. Holy Cross Academy it was called. And she just fell in love with the setting, the Catholicism, what she was experiencing in prayer and teaching of it by the nuns, and became very close to one of the nuns, and converted to the Catholic Church and was baptized at age 14. So she, of course, grew up in Catholic, and then many years later married my father here in Richmond. He had come from Salem, Virginia. The Bowman family there had orchards and a purebred Jersey dairy farm. But my father came to Richmond after graduating from Roanoke College there in Salem, and subsequently met my mother, and they became engaged. He was Lutheran, a strong German background in Lutheran family, and they were married in 1913 and lived here and established their home here in Richmond.
I see. So they were married in 1913.
Yes,
And your father was Lutheran and your mother was Catholic.
correct.
I'm always fascinated, you've told me that story before, that your grandmother, who herself was Episcopalian, had married a Catholic man and who passed away. It would have been so easy for her to raise your mother as an Episcopalian and to just let that be her faith tradition.
Yes.
But out of a sense of honoring your grandfather's memory and a sense of commitment to sharing his faith with your mother, that they sent her to that school in Washington.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, they felt an obligation to do that. That always impressed me as the way good people do things. They know by conscience, by commitment, and they carry it out. And I was so proud to know that my ancestors did that, my grandmother and my mother.
And I have reflected to you before that it strikes me that that decision of conscience and character that they made so many years ago is a blessing in my life, because quite literally we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. You may very well have been an Episcopalian or a Lutheran, and our paths might not have crossed, but a decision made so many years ago is still having very positive consequences so many years later. And so I'm grateful for your ancestors as well. So your mother and father were married in 1913. What did your father do in terms of his business?
He was, I'm not sure of his business in 1913, but he became he might have started at that age in the real estate business. So he was in real estate. His firm was headquartered on Main Street. Laburnum Realty Company was a major real estate firm for the city in many ways.
Yes. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, your mother was also involved in business, wasn't she?
Well, she was, but not at that time.
Yes.
When they were married, my mother had a lovely contralto voice, and she sang in several choirs in the city, and she was active, for example, in selling war bonds before World War I. That was, 1913 went into later on the World War I.
Yes.
So she sold more war bonds than anybody in Richmond, and I have a little framed citation recognizing her for doing that.
I see.
And so she was very active in life around her in the community, as well as singing. I think she taught piano briefly. She graduated from the school in Washington in music, in voice, in harp, and piano. And she had a lovely contralto voice, and many years later, she was in the choir as a soloist at St. Benedict's for many years until she passed away.
I see.
You asked about business. It was in Mother and Dad. Children did not come, and during this period that I've just spoken of. And so in 1923, there was a small business on 8th Street, 28 North 8th Street, that one-man printing operation. Mother, through her civic and city works, community works, knew something about business. As a matter of fact, earlier in about 1920, 21, 22, one of the leading banks on Main Street hired her to open a woman's department. at the bank. They gave her a made-up name because in those days, not many women, worked. And so they wanted to protect her privacy and so forth. So they gave her a name, I forget, I think it was Lillian maybe, with a few other words attached, for this women's department at the bank. And so because the world had gotten to recognize, and business knew, that women bought about, or handled about 80% of the family's wealth or money.
Yes.
They did the shopping, they did the buying, they did all of that. So that's why the bank wanted to open a women's department and asked my mother to head it, and she did. And then a few years later, it was in, as I said, in 1923, she bought this one-man printing business and developed that. Then 1 year later, after she did that, her twins were born. My brother and I were born in 1924. So that also took her in another direction.
Yes.
And she called us her Lamekins.
Lamekins?
Yes, and I think that I always connect that with the Lamb of God.
Oh, wonderful.
Because she was a practicing Catholic and loved the Catholic Church, loved the church.
Wonderful. So your brother's name was?
Killian Bowman, J. Killian Bowman, Jr.
And the two of you grew up here in Richmond together.
Yes.
And where did Killian go to school?
Well, we both went to, the first school we went to was a pre-kindergarten, and it was on the roof of a 3-story building on something like Meadow Street, north of Main Street. It was a very well-liked private school, pre-nursery. Mm-hmm. And then after that, we went to parochial school for about a year, and then we moved to public school in our area. And that was Patrick Henry School, and we went there, finished Patrick Henry, and went to Albert H. Hill Normal School on the near on Patterson Avenue. And it's still in operation today. It was a wonderful school.
Wonderful. When you were growing up with your brother and your mother, I'm assuming that you were active participants in the local parish, in the local church?
Yes, to the extent that that was the case in those days. This was long before Vatican II. This was when Mass was in Latin. This was when the priest faced the back of the priest was to the congregation.
Yes.
And of course we had the obligation to go to Mass every Sunday, so we went to Mass every Sunday. And we went to school, Bible class at the church at St. Benedict's for a while, and so that was Catholics kind of relied upon the church leadership, meaning the priests and the bishop, and you looked upon them as the knowledge and experience and leader, and you just followed the rules.
Yes.
And were very happy and thought if you went to church on Sunday, every Sunday, if you went to confession regularly, you were doing the right thing.
Right.
And so we did the right thing.
Yes, wonderful. Now, historically, as you and your brother were reaching young adulthood, of course, World War II breaks out across Europe. And it's my understanding that your brother served our nation in that way. Would you mind telling us that story of Killian's service to our country?
in World War II, when we got into World War II on D-Day, December 1941, all of the men were not only going to be called up, and all men had to serve, but they wanted to. Everyone, they were so fearful of the Nazis and Hitler had gone so far into Europe, and they were bombing with the projectiles they had at that time, Britain, England. And we did not get in the war when it first started. There was some opposition to in the U.S. against the war, our joining it. So finally it happened when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and that was it. And I remember I was a freshman in college, and that was a Sunday, and we were invited to several of us my friends at Goucher were invited to a luncheon on that Sunday, and we were getting ready to start out Sunday luncheon when the radio, small little radio over on a table in the corner, came on with Franklin Roosevelt, the president.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
And we were now at war and joined the Allies in the war. So anyway, subsequently, my brother, who was a student then at VMI, Virginia Military Institute, was called to join the Army. He applied at that time for the Air Corps, the Air Force today, but it was the Army Air Corps then.
Yes.
And he applied for training school. He wanted to be a pilot. So he was admitted to training school, and flight training school, and he subsequently, in about maybe 2 years, I think it was a year and a half to 2 years training, moving him from place to place for the training. And so he got his wings, and his wings meant that what he had succeeded in doing, in learning, he could be a pilot, a bombardier, or navigator. Well, during his VMI time, he was on the wrestling team, and he broke his arm. And they set his arm at the local hospital in Lexington. Unfortunately, it was set incorrectly, so several weeks later, he was brought to Richmond when this was discovered, and the arm was broken and reset. Well, when Killian had to make the decision about whether to be a pilot or bombardier or navigator, he decided that he had only 50% rotation in the arm that had been broken, and that if he were a pilot, he would have a crew with him, most likely. And their lives would depend upon him in a situation that might require that full or that fault in his arm might mean that they would lose their lives. And so he chose navigation. And so he was first lieutenant as a navigator. Subsequently was sent to England for the 8th Air Force of the United States, stationed in England. He was there, went in October, and in January on his, I believe it was the 13th mission, his plane was shot down. He was the navigator on a B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, and the plane was shot down. He parachuted out. We did not know for a long time. The only thing we knew was that the plane was shot down in January. In February, early February, our doorbell rang, and it was the Army War Department informing us that he was missing in action. And that for a long time, that's all we knew. The War Department, although we had much correspondence back and forth with the War Department, today the Defense Department, about they're looking for him or trying to find out what happened when the plane was shot down, and with no success. After the war was over, this was 1945, and January and February, and the war was over in Europe in May. At that time, forces, people, men and women who were in the armed forces went home, many of them, including French officers who were imprisoned in Germany. And when people began to get home in June, a letter addressed to my brother we received at our home in Richmond. And so, of course, and it was in French. So none of us, I spoke a little French, I knew a little French, but we didn't know enough. We wanted to know what this was, so we found someone down at the YWCA who spoke French fluently. So we hastened there, and she translated this letter from a French soldier who said he had gotten home, when the war was over, that he made his way back to France, and he wanted to know what had happened to my brother. And so that was just the first news. This was June, and he was shot down in January. So this was the first news that we had. Of course, we sent it to the War Department. The War Department got in touch with the French former military member of the French Army, and I asked him to go to Paris and testify what he knew to the American War Department office there, which he did. And so what he told was that when they were prisoners of the Germans, and their work assignment, they, however, were in a little different setup from the usual war prisoner camp, because they had been, France, as you recall, surrendered to the Germans in early like 1940 perhaps, and so these were the French officers, members of the French army, who had been captured before, and so when France surrendered, they were put in a prison camp that was not the same as what we learned later about all the usual prison camps. And there were about 100 of them in that camp. They saw my brother walking through the woods, signaled to him to hide, and they would come back and get him that night. And so that's what they did. They took care of him in that camp for 3 days. One of the prisoners disappeared, so the nose count in the prison camp wouldn't be changed, and that because while they did not have as close as rigid a situation as others in prison camps. They were checked on every night, and for example, and it could be checked on any time during the daytime. Their work was out in the fields working for, I think, a horse facility. The Germans had a lot of horses and used them in their wars,
Yes.
even into World War II. And so he stayed there for 3 days. They communicated back and forth. We have later on, soon after we received this first letter, we received 4 and 5 and 6 letters from the other Frenchmen in that unit who were writing to my brother to see if he got what happened to him. And so anyway, after 3 days, and during the 3 days at that prison camp, because my brother's French was like mine, needed a lot of help, there were little notes that he wrote, and they wrote to him in French questions, and he'd answer. And one of these Frenchmen sent those notes, and they were little torn bits of paper. And I recognized my brother's handwriting, and of course, they were asking him where he'd been and what was going on. They knew nothing about the progress of the war. The Germans told them nothing. They'd been in that camp for 5 and 6 years. So anyway, it turns out that the crew of my brother's plane were told the morning the morning they left, flew from Britain, from England, that if they were shot down to try to get to the northern Europe, Rostock on the Baltic Sea, and try to stow away on a neutral ship and identify themselves in hopes that they would be taken to a neutral port. So with that in mind, the Frenchmen decided the best thing they could do for Killy, we called him, Killy was his nickname, was to stow him away on a boxcar of a train going through where their camp was right close. They were very close to the rail station. And so early in the morning, in the dark, they stowed him and put him on a boxcar headed for Rostock. The train was headed for Rostock. And that was the last that they saw of him. And so the War Department took all this information. The war was over. The Soviet Union, as it was then, it had not changed back to Russia at that time. Soviet Union was in charge of that part of the war zone. The war zone that was East Germany, as many will remember. And they were not helpful with our War Department in following up on that information of that train and what train it might have been and what happened. So that was in 1945, summer. And so that was all we knew. We kept, we did have a visit from the bombardier, and he came to see us in Richmond. He was either from Kentucky or Tennessee. It was such a nice thing for him to do. And he came to us that summer to visit, to tell us what had happened when the plane was shot down. And he told us that day that a big group of German fighters, ME-109s, came up and shot down. It was an unusually bad day for the American Air Force and for the Allies, and shot down a number of the B-17 bombers, including Killies. And so anyway, the bombardier told us that there was an order for them if they were shot or disabled there was an order for them to follow to parachute out. And so the bombardier told us that the navigator went before the bombardier. And so he said he watched Killian jump and saw his parachute open, which was very good. And he also told us that Killian was not wounded in the plane. There were 2 or 3 who died in the plane from the German fighters. So that was another piece of information that we knew that we knew that he was not hurt too because of the Frenchman and his being taken care of by the French. So with that, the next information that came was months later, that they had received that the Allies retrieved a record in the German air port at Rostock that said a Lieutenant J.K. Bowman Jr. had died January 19th. And of course, that was still 1945. And so he left the prison camp, French prison camp, on, say, the 16th or something, or 17th maybe. And this report from the German airport was that he died, that Lieutenant J. Killian Bowman Jr. had died on the 19th of January. So that was big news. And it, of course, told us that he was not living and that he had lost his life. But with that information, our forces kept looking for him and making contacts and so on. And the next thing was that he was found buried in a German civilian cemetery in Rostock. And so by that time, my mother, the dates, she knew about the French involvement, but she did not know that he had died. She contracted cancer in September, went to the hospital September. This was again the same year, a few months after he was shot down. And she died in the hospital. She was there 6 months, and without knowing that he had been, before he was found, and before the record was found that he had been killed, and also, of course, his being found in the cemetery. Well, my father and I decided that, and the War Department permitted this, and it was such a blessing for us that we could either, as soon as the War Department found that he was buried there, they removed him to a U.S. cemetery and of the military, and we could either leave him there or bring him back to Richmond. And so we, of course, wanted him brought back to Richmond and buried next to his mother and with the family here. And he was brought back and buried at Hollywood subsequent to that. And so now I'm so happy that a very nice friend who is a writer wants to write the story, Killian's story. So we are in the process now of using the volumes of files I have and correspondence and documents about all of this to write his story. And that makes me very happy because his life was an important life, like all of those who served in the military or anywhere. But he had not had a chance to really use it to the fullest or to a full extent. And so now his story will be told, and he'll be like one of us in the community, known in the community.
Yes. I'm thinking about the news that you and your father received in that time then, later in 1945, as your mother was experiencing her cancer. And then after her passing, then receiving the definitive word that your brother had lost his life in service to his country. Significant losses coming very quickly for you at that time. How did your faith help you deal with those sad experiences?
It's just a strength that you cannot define in a material way. It's just your strength and your hope and your love for your family and your understanding and great sadness. And I know it was just so hard on my mother that he was missing, and we did not know where he was, how he was. And that was very hard.
Yes. After the war ends, your life continued, and you eventually married.
Yes, I did.
Tell me how you met
Very young.
your future husband. And tell us his name so that we all can know.
My husband was Alexander Hutchison Williams, Jr., and he was grew up in both Richmond and in Buckingham County, where the Williamses, with their Welsh background, had opened a quarry, a slate quarry, and it was so he was involved in that. And Alec graduated from BMI in the class of 42, and of course went straight into the Army, and was in the States for about a year at different camps and forts training, and went abroad to be in the war, but in the European section of the war. About the same time my brother had gone.
I see.
And it was late 1944 that October and November. And so he was in France and fought in the U.S. Army in France.
I see. And when he came home, is that when you met? After his return from the war? Or had you met him before that?
Oh, I knew him. We grew up in Richmond, and I knew who they were, and they knew who I was. And and we went to, both families went to St. Benedict's Church on Sunday. And so I knew them. And we were married in the war, in 1943. And he was stationed in California. And so he got permission to come home to get married, but we were ready to go. Mother was perfectly willing to. We were going to go out there to California if he lost his leave, and that was always possible, right? So as soon as we were married, we got in the car and drove to California, and that was 1943.
I have been privileged to see a photograph of you and your husband walking out of the cathedral at the conclusion of your wedding in a beautiful wedding dress that I believe all of your daughters ended up wearing at their weddings too.
I have 3 wonderful daughters and 2 wonderful sons. But the 3 daughters, and I was very sure I was not going to try to influence my daughters to wear my wedding gown, because I thought, they're getting married, they're starting off on their own life, and I want them to do what they want to do. Well, every one of them, and they're not all the same shape and size by any means, but they all wore my wedding dress. So I have a picture of each one of them in the wedding, the day when they were married, and I've got them all the 4 pictures, their 3 and mine together, and it's kind of fun. The same dress, same brooch on the dress and everything.
Yes. But not the same shoes, if I understand.
No,
Is that right?
mine were in World War II. You couldn't find things like evening shoes. I mean, it's very hard to find anything, almost. So I got a pair of white bedroom slippers, and they were my wedding shoes.
When I was a child, I remember being fascinated by the rationing stamps that my grandfather had saved during the war. My grandfather was a farmer, and so there were rationing stamps for gasoline and meat and butter and all of the necessities. And so my parents and grandparents tried to explain what it was like during the war effort, those years from 1941 to 45, where everyone was sacrificing. And in your case, you couldn't find shoes for your wedding, so you wore slippers.
That's true.
I think that the current generation of Americans has no concept of what that might be like, where those basic necessities just were scarce at that time, weren't they?
Absolutely, and everything was for the war effort. And things were rationed, gas was rationed. Some people put their automobile on a stack of bricks. The tires would be on the bricks to protect the tires, and also because you just couldn't, and gas was rationed, so you were short of everything. Food at the store. I remember that they wanted you to bring, if you had any grease left over from cooking, to save that and take it to the meat department, because they would then, whatever they did to reuse it in some way.
Yes.
And yes, that was true.
You mentioned your 5 wonderful children. Would you please tell us their names and what they're currently doing now?
Well, let's see, I'll start with the oldest. My son, Alec, named for his father, Alec Williams, has recently retired as judge of the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, and he went to, now is a mediator. He hasn't stopped working. He has taken up the profession of mediation and likes it very much. Yes. Then Jay, my next child, was an architect whose wonderful business folded when a new the business was bought out by someone who didn't know anything about building and architecture, and he bought it out just at the time of the economic setback we had a few years ago. So he, at his age, tender age in the 60s, was looking for a job, and he's now with Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, a very big and fine United States military operation. Yes. So he's working there as a as a non-military Army person. Yes. In the Vietnam War, he was a lieutenant in the nuclear power forces, and he trained under Admiral Rickover to be a nuclear engineer, and then when he finished his that course, he was assigned to the only nuclear-powered cruiser that the U.S. Navy had, and I remember his telling me how when he joined the cruiser in Vietnam, of course it was in the water, and he said that engine room was so hot, not only because of the nuclear power, but because of the hot waters of the Vietnam big rivers. And before that, so he was, of course, in the Navy then, and now is working for the Army. And so that,
Yes.
brings some nice jokes and so
Yes.
forth.
And your daughters, tell us about your daughters, please.
Geline is a lawyer, and she and her husband, who's a lawyer, have both retired from their positions in Boston and have formed their own law firm, expecting it to be just a small law firm, and where they can serve clients, but be able to keep from overdoing.
Yes.
So,
all right.
and then the next one, Gina, is her husband is. She and her husband live in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where my son-in-law Dave is the dean of the School of Business at Middle Tennessee State University. Mm-hmm. So Gina, when they first left Richmond 4 years ago and went down there to Tennessee, she worked part-time for the university too, but she didn't do that for very long, and she now has gotten involved in the community with community services, and she has started her own service business, small business, to assist people in printing and composing.
Yes.
Whatever they want composed or prepared, and she has enjoyed that very much, and she is active with an organization of women who are business and professional women, and they undertake services in the community and services to those who need help in the business world.
Yes. And there's one more daughter, I believe.
Anne, my youngest. And Anne is in banking with international finance, national and international finance on the western side of the globe.
I see.
And she has 3 sons. Gina, my daughter in Tennessee, has a son and a daughter, and Jay and Kathleen have 4 children, 1 girl and 4 boys, and Alec has 2 daughters. So, and did I say Geline has a daughter? Okay. So I feel like, we talk about our lives and what we do, but I don't think we realize how much families give to the world, and that all of us, whatever it is, we are gifts to the world. Yes. And I think it helps me to think of that because of how great we are, because God made us.
That's right. One of the ways I know that you and your husband tried to be a gift to the world is by your involvement in your church, both your local parish of St. Bridget, and also the broader church in so many different kinds of efforts. I know in a special way that you and your husband had a passion about the right to life. Can you speak a little bit about how you became involved in that and where that led?
Well, I was involved, and I felt I was the only one involved. It was back in 1960, in the mid-60s, that at that time, Virginia and most states had a law that prohibited abortion. It was, and no one talked about the subject of abortion. It was a terrible subject, and it was just dishonorable. It was just something so bad that you didn't even discuss it. Well, this effort began in the mid-60s to make abortion legal. And at that time, the proponents of it had put together a masterful effort to change, to get people interested in this subject and to get their support for it by appealing to them that this was a subject that many women, it was so hard for women to have babies that when they were going to be malformed or when they were too poor to take care of, or in college it would ruin their education. And throughout this whole masterful plan ran the thesis that only the Catholic Church was opposed to abortion, to turn people against the Catholic Church, to appeal to bigotry, appeal to hate, and to win support. So this effort was coming across the country in the middle 60s. And I just saw it coming, and I talked to other people about it in the church, in my parish, or wherever I was. And I was involved in the church because I was part of what was a very effective Catholic women's organization in the diocese. And I headed it, and at one time others much better informed and very smart women headed it than I was. And we had a legislative program for good legislation for the poor, for health, for different reasons. And so I was a little involved in that. So when this effort to legalize abortion started, I was on the, in that milieu. And so I knew what they were trying to do, and I knew we ought to have something that stood up against nothing. There was nobody opposing it. And since it was only the Catholic Church who opposed it, then nobody else wanted to oppose it. That was the idea. So we started a group in the mid-60s, called together someone over there, someone in another town, and put together a steering committee to protect Virginia's abortion law from being changed. And so we had a doctors committee, we had a lawyers committee, and then others too. So we had something concrete. And in 1967, we established the Virginia Society for Human Life. And my husband was made first president of it. And I was just in the back line, back behind the others, doing a lot of typing on the typewriter and making copies on onion skin paper. I mean, you don't know any of this, but there's a whole lot of it then. And through communication, with just adding on everyone we could here and there throughout the Diocese of Richmond, we were able to do that. It was not a Catholic group. We had, and it was not a church group. It was a group, a public group, and we had some Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and others, but many of them were Catholic. And so that's how we started, my husband and I, and he was very nice. He was a businessman. Our family business demanded his time and all the time, but he did this, and so we got it started.
Your passion for that topic has not abated in all of the decades that have followed and all of the...
No, but they thought it would.
Yes.
The proponents of abortion kept saying, this is going to go away, but it doesn't go away.
Yes.
For not only religious and spiritual reasons, but also because this is the USA, and the first right we have is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And taking away or legalizing abortion takes away that right to life. And so it was not just for spiritual or faith reasons, it was also for our country, and still is.
Yes.
And I remember one convention, National Right to Life Annual Convention, one of the speakers at that convention was Mother Teresa, and she said that as long as we have legalized, and by that time Roe v. Wade had come down, and she said as long as we have abortion, we'll never have peace. We'll always have wars. She was a great supporter and promoter of the right to life.
Your work on behalf of the unborn eventually led you to be the chair of National Right to Life. Am I correct?
The National Right to Life Committee really formed about a year after Virginia Society for Human Life was the first state pro-life organization. Others were coming right behind it, but we were the first to organize. And it was very shortly after that some of the people we'd gotten involved with were working in Washington, and the National Right to Life Committee came together, very small, and grew and grew and grew. So it now has an affiliate in each of the 50 states, and its board of directors has a representative from each of the 50 states on the board. And I happen to be the one that VSHL sent, Virginia Society of Human Life sent to be on the board for Virginia. Right. And in that, some years later, I became chairman of the board.
You are still a member of the board, if I'm not mistaken. How many years were you the chair of the board for National Right to Life? 35. 35. Well, thank you for that, your ongoing dedicated service to that very important topic. Where we are today in our country on that subject, what do you see as the signs of hope around that very important issue?
The hope is the formation of people in our country to the importance of the right to life and the importance of protecting innocent human life. So we have great hope. We've made progress, solid progress, very slowly, but there is great hope that we can continue. We've enacted federal laws in Congress and state laws that wherever we could do it legally, that it would not offend against Roe v. The Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade that abortion was legal. But there were things we found through study and scholarly work on the part of the departments at National Right to Life in finding ways and avenues that could protect some of the babies. For example, the Hyde Amendment to the budget every year prohibits the use of tax money to pay for Medicaid abortions. And that's very important. And when Congressman Hyde discovered how many abortions were paid for by the federal government through Medicaid, then he put together the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits tax money from funding the Medicaid abortions. Yes. And it was thousands and thousands of babies who died, who were killed. It's still in force, but it has to be reenacted every year. So those of us, people like me work, and National Right to Life, Virginia Society of Human Life work to keep that Hyde Amendment. Yes. And the other forces want to get rid of it and are trying to.
Right. You have seen so much important so many important aspects of our nation's history and our church's history too. You lived through the experience of the Second Vatican Council and the changes that happened in the daily life of the church after that. What was your experience of growing up in the church before the council, and what excited you about what the Second Vatican Council did for the church?
Oh, that we would no longer, well, the Latin Mass went out, and I think for a while that some bishops, some dioceses permitted Latin Mass because of some, to make it smoother for people. And, but it was just exciting to me and to all of the Catholic friends I had made over the years that, and worked with through the Council of Catholic Women and through the National Right to Life. Well, that too is not a religious organization, but there are many Catholics on that, in that organization. The president and the executive director, who are two brilliant people, are not Catholic,
yes.
but there are some Catholics, a number of Catholics involved. But the Vatican Council too was just like Pope John the 23rd said, opening a window. And I just envisioned that window, and I think there were, you'd see drawings like that, or representation of the window with the curtain blowing out,
Yes.
And it was exciting, absolutely exciting. And and when the council finished and had its documents, then the Council of Catholic Women, which was still very active then, the one that I was involved with, took all of those documents and assigned them to a committee in each of the parish. The organization was by parish, with a state diocesan president too. And so we learned, and the job was to learn to read those documents and then to have something at the parish level to educate others about those documents. And that was just great. And Bishop Russell set up a commission, and I was on that down. We met down at the where the offices were on Cathedral Place, where the diocese.
Yes.
So it was very exciting, and I was privileged to have the opportunity to be a part of it.
Yes.
But there's just poor lay people, we used to call it the laity. You don't hear much about the laity. You hear about parishioners and so forth in committees, yes. But it brought the clergy into much better relationship with the people, and and it was just great.
Wonderful, thank you. You try to go to Mass almost every day as your schedule permits. What is important to you about going to Mass on a daily basis?
The Holy Eucharist, celebrating the Holy Eucharist, that Jesus died that terrible death on the cross to save us from our sins, and he rose from the dead to give us eternal life. So the Holy Eucharist, I just love, and I try to go to Mass every day. Yes. But I'd sometimes miss it because the alarm doesn't go off or something like that.
Yes, yes. At one point, in all of the wonderful work that you've done on behalf of the church and our community, life took you into politics as well. Can you speak briefly about how you ended up as the mayor of Richmond?
Well, first of all, I must say that my mother and father raised my brother and me by their own example and by what they've said and talked about, to be responsible citizens, that you have a responsibility to your neighborhood, to your city, your state, whatever, to the community, and to do your share. And voting was very important, and as soon as we were of age to register to vote, that's what we did, and we always, never missed a an election. So my parental influence was just so much in my life, and in the lives of others too, I know. But and in my life, as time went on, I got interested. I took part in community affairs and organizations like well, first of all, I was the Catholic Women's Organization, and I was also head of the Richmond Instructed Visiting Nurse Association, IVNA, for a number of years, and chairman of it. And I really learned a lot about the community in that job. It was, of course, it was volunteer. This was the board of directors, but we learned so much from the work of the IVNA. It served, with doctor's orders, it served people sick in their homes, and would visit. It was on a visit basis where they taught the family how to care for the patient in the home, and I actually went around the area and saw some of the homes and met some of the people, and I was just educated by that experience. To the great need for service of that kind, nursing service, medical service, and I learned, it really just opened my eyes. So I took interest in the community, and I was a member of the community fund and the earlier names for what we have now as voluntary services, nonprofits. So that through those, I served on I was president of the board of Catholic Family and Children's Services, and that's had several names. And throughout its history, and that did volunteer work in adoption, of family counseling, all kinds of social services. So I learned there, and several other organizations. So when in mid-80s, 1980s, our city member of the city council for the district in which we lived came to me and said he'd served several terms, and they were 2-year terms. And he said he had served 5 terms maybe or something, and he said he did not want to run again. He had enjoyed it, but he wanted to be with his family more, and he's not going to run, and he wanted me to know about it and to think about doing it. So I was surprised. I talked to Alec about it, and he, of course, brought up the joke about married women. I forget what it was, but it was a joke. But he said he encouraged me to do it. So with that, I announced that I was going to run for city council. I had an opponent, and I remember one time I did not want to break the law by putting posters of my picture where you weren't supposed to put them, like on telephone poles and in public areas of public property. And so one night I came home from a meeting. You went to a lot of neighborhood meetings to speak for to vote for, to encourage people to vote for you. And I was coming home one night down Grove Avenue. We lived near Grove Avenue. And there was my poster on every telephone pole going down the middle of Grove Avenue out in that district where I represented. And so when I got home, I said, how did those posters get up there? He said, well, I had seen so many of your opponent that I just went ahead and put them up. So he did. And so it was very interesting. I did win the election, and I ran. I served 5 terms on the council, 2-year terms. And in the middle of that, in the city council at that time elected the mayor from among its people. There were 9 members of the city council. And I decided, well, in the middle of that term of about 84, the council elected me as mayor for that term. And the mayor was elected right after the elections for the members of the council. And so I was elected, and it got on the news, and so I do have a very nice beautician. That is, he does my hair, fixes my hair. And so it was said that about 12 o'clock, someone walked into his beauty shop and said, did you know that Geline Williams was elected as mayor? And he said, no, because she would have called me first. Come and have her hair. So anyway, but it was an exciting time, and I did serve as mayor, and I learned a lot. I'm very appreciative for knowing about, and I respect the responsibility of civic service, both in an elected position and in professional positions on the workforces of the city. And it was just a very interesting and wonderful time.
My last question to you, Mrs. Williams. When you say your prayers each day and you get to the prayers of thanksgiving, what are you most grateful to God for in your life?
My life and the lives of my family and my friends, and for my many blessings, and for the opportunities I've had to grow in life and grow in understanding of relationships and friendships, and especially in faith. I'm just very grateful for my Catholic faith. I'm very blessed, and that I always give thanks for.
Amen. Thank you, and God bless you for all that you do.